The Automated Podcast.
Welcome to the Automated Podcast. I'm your host, Marc Verbenkov. So although in previous episodes, I haven't really spoken much about the impact that technology and automation in general has had on the biomedical industry, it is certainly a really interesting topic for the podcast, especially as the application of new medical technologies are going to really change the way that we deal with public health over the next few decades, really more than ever before. And this is only going to be hastened by the fact that we now live in an era of COVID. So really, with this in mind, I'm happy to have on my guest this week to discuss automation and how it is impacting drug discovery. So Martin-Immanuel Bittner is the CEO of Arctoris. This is the world's first fully automated drug discovery platform that he co-founded in Oxford. So Martin graduated as a medical doctor from the University of Freiburg in Germany, followed with his PhD in oncology as a Rhodes Scholar at the University of Oxford. So Martin has extensive research experience covering both clinical trials and preclinical drug discovery and is an active member of several leading cancer research organizations. In recognition of his research achievements, he was elected a member of the Young Academy of the German National Academy of Sciences in 2018. So in today's podcast, Martin and I discuss the current state of drug discovery, how Arctoris and automation solves a number of the challenges facing the industry, how COVID has impacted the industry, how his company as well as automation impacts jobs, and what the future of drug discovery might look like. Great. Well, hi there, Martin. Thanks for coming on to the Automated Podcast.
It's very nice to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
So I was quite interested to have you come on and talk about your business, Arctoris, which does a lot of R&D in drug discovery. Also, it has quite an automated process in which that's done. But one of the things I like to ask guests before we jump into those kinds of issues is, how did you get interested in the work that you do beforehand?
Absolutely. So I think in this case, kind of the story really basically starts with my undergraduate degree. So I grew up in Germany and did my medical doctorate and my medical degree kind of while being in Germany. And with that background, I basically worked as a doctor mainly within oncology. So my background is basically very much clinical medicine, oncology, patient care. But at the very same time, when working in oncology in particular, you do realize that what we desperately need is new and better drugs and new and better treatments. That's what got me interested in doing research and in gaining basically full-time research experience. And that was then the reason why I moved to the UK, did my PhD in cancer drug discovery.
Okay, and maybe it would be interesting for the audience to hear, because I think that there might not be too many people with a medical background that listen to the podcast, but as your company focuses on drug discovery research and kind of maybe a new way of doing it, can you maybe describe a little bit as to how drug discovery has been done in the past?
Sure. So in general, drug discovery is a process that is very long, very expensive, and unfortunately also quite error-prone. At the moment, developing one new drug takes about 10 to 15 years and in excess of $2 billion. The way kind of that this process works is that you have various stages within the drug discovery process. The very first stage is the so-called discovery phase, where you're working on a new target. A new target could, for example, be a certain gene or a gene product. You then basically move from this target into identifying hits, leads, and candidates, which is basically different refinement stages of what in the end could become a new drug. And once you have sufficient data from the discovery phase, you then move into testing these new potential drugs first in animals, and then of course also in patients. And this is then called basically clinical trials, which basically happen in various phases, and they can then in the end lead to an approval process done, for example, by the FDA or by the EMA and other regulatory authorities. But this whole process very much takes, as I said before, 10 to 15 years, so a very long time. And at the same time, this is also something which mostly relies on manual labor. So scientists in laboratories will spend 6, 7, 8 hours every day manually performing experiments on cells, proteins, etc.
Yeah, I think that's one of the key points that we'll get into a little bit later. Also, I think this is very error prone to failing. At any point, there could be one of the phases completely fails, and then you have to kind of start from scratch, but with a new set of drugs that you want to discover.
That is correct. So you can basically imagine the drug discovery process to look like a funnel. So at the top of the funnel, you're going to have thousands of different ideas, targets, hypotheses, hits, leads, etc. And in the end, if you're lucky, you're going to have one single new drug being approved. So in other words, it is indeed a process where you try a lot of things to then, at each and every stage, reduce the number of opportunities and reduce the number of things you're working on. Because in the end, it is something where the chance of success overall is quite low. And this is something that also has been put into numbers. So all of us are familiar with Moore's law, where we look at transistor density, and that's basically kind of the doubling, basically roughly kind of doubling in processing power that happens every 18 to 24 months. We do have a very similar law in the pharmaceutical industry as well. It's just the reverse, so it's called Ehrum's law. And Ehrum's law describes how basically drug approval per research dollar spent is something that has been going down consistently for the past about 50 years. So we're actually not very good in bringing new drugs to market, and unfortunately we're getting worse and worse at it. So at the moment we're looking kind of at, basically, as I said, several billions per drugs being required, and that is a massive issue, because an industry that is not very productive means that at some point, if the trend continues, and it currently looks like it does, then we're going to end up in an environment where developing just one new drug is so expensive that companies can no longer afford to go through that process. And that's something everybody in the industry is quite afraid of.
And is this because kind of the low-hanging fruit has already been successfully discovered over the last 50, 60, 70 years or so?
I mean, there's various reasons to it. I don't think enough anyone knows precisely what the exact basic reasons are. However, there's multiple hypotheses. One of them is, as you just said, the low-hanging fruit. So we already picked kind of the easiest targets. We've already worked on those. Another trend that is obviously of great concern is data quality. So it has become apparent over the past few years that the quality of research data is very poor. There were one or two companies, including American biotech company Amgen and German pharma company Bayer, who took basically their target validation team's efforts and published those. So they said, we took research findings from the literature, things that have been published, peer-reviewed, and things that were assumed to be fully correct and valid, and we try to reproduce them. And these companies found that only 10 to 20% of all published research findings were actually reproducible. So in other words, we're working in an environment where data quality is a huge factor that is currently not being addressed properly.
I would say that that's a significant drawback to the entire drug discovery ecosystem. I would also assume that this is in large part due to human error during that discovery process, no?
There's multiple factors that basically play into it. I mean, so some of the key factors that have been identified, one is scientific protocols. So basically the recipes that scientists would follow when performing an experiment are not very accurate. So these scientific protocols are supposed to give you a complete description of how the experiment works and how you're supposed to perform it. However, they're very ambiguous. So for example, a scientific protocol might say, mix the sample, but mixing is something which can happen in so many different ways. It could be shaking, could be stirring, could be for half a minute, could be for 5 minutes. So in other words, we're dealing with scientific instructions that are not very precise. And that is something which leads to differences in scientific outcomes. A very important point is the quality of the research reagents. Every researcher uses, for example, cell lines. So cell lines basically are being used to test new hypotheses. However, under a microscope, many cell lines look very similar. And so over time, it is very easy for cell lines to get mixed up or to get contaminated. And one of the scary numbers that came out a few years ago is that about 1 in 2 cell lines is actually not what we think it is. So you're a researcher and you think you're working on a human liver cell line. Instead, it turns out it's a mouse kidney cell line. So these things, of course, can have tremendous impact on the quality of research results.
That's both very interesting and also very scary, I think, for people that are going to be using, say, vaccines by the millions in the next couple of years due to COVID. I would assume that these kind of issues are also the same with COVID research and the vaccine development. Maybe we want to shift gears here and talk a little bit about your business, Arctoris, because I think this is bringing about a kind of a different process, a different way of discovering drugs. Maybe you can talk a little bit about it, and also, of course, we'll dive into the kind of the automated process of that, which is the main interest or main relevant point for the podcast itself.
Absolutely. So I think the idea behind Arctoris was very much born when I was doing the PhD in the UK, and I realized when doing the PhD and doing kind of the lab research, without having had previous lab experience, I was just very surprised to find that all of these highly qualified PhD students, postdocs, junior professors would still spend so much time manually performing experiments, where I thought there were so many more important things to take care of. Thinking through an experiment, reading the literature, discussing the results, preparing the next idea, the next project. So in other words, it is a work mode where not a lot has changed over the past few decades. And this is basically the starting point for Arctoris, where we said we want to replace manual labor with automation so that scientists can spend their time thinking, designing, hypothesizing, and can leave experimental execution to a robot.
Very interesting, but also highly relevant to the themes that keep coming up in the podcast. Kind of wherever we look to automation in any kind of sector, this is the main trend that keeps coming up, right? It's not the full out replacement of human labor, but rather kind of an augmentation of the individual in whatever industry we're looking at, to focus on the more higher level or complex tasks that still go along with the work. One of the things I wanted to ask you about the process in which you're doing is maybe the time interval. So you were saying 10 to 15 years for drug discovery using the traditional methods. Is this still the same thing with Arctoris? I know that you use a number of different, say, robotic systems. Does that shorten the time considerably, or is there still such a kind of a highly regulated way in which this is done that even that time can't be reduced?
So given the drug discovery process as such consists of many different components, basically the discovery phase, the animal experimentation phase, the clinical trials, and so on, this means you need to change things on many different levels to really have an impact on shortening the overall timeline. What we can do in the lab is already leading to time savings. So we already have companies working with us because they can see how we can perform experiments and complete projects much faster. So in other words, we definitely see these savings. But what I think is even more important is that as of now, scientists in biotech companies and pharma companies would frequently work on projects where they don't really know whether they're going to work out or not, because data quality is poor and data annotation is insufficient. So if we can give people access to the right amount of data at the right time, they can really make much better decisions early on. And ideally, instead of working on 20 projects with one succeeding, they might only work on 4 or 5 projects with one succeeding. So in other words, I think the time saving is something which comes from both machinery working 24/7 and experiments just happening faster, but it as much also comes from the fact that you can really trust in the data you're working with.
Also, maybe to give the audience a little bit more of a kind of a tangible visual to what you're doing. So you have your own lab where these robots and the systems that you have in place, the automated systems you have in place, are kind of on your site, and you have an online platform that your clients are able to access and manipulate the kind of different testing parameters that they want in order to do the drug discovery. Is that correct?
That is correct. So we do have a robotic lab facility in Oxford in the UK. And within that robotic lab, you will find different types of scientific equipment, microscopes and plate readers, and all of the various different devices that scientists would use in their daily work in the labs. And everything is then connected with robotic arms, conveyor belts, and contained within a sterile enclosure that contains HEPA filters and the like. So in other words, you would walk into a laboratory that contains scientific instruments, logistics elements, liquid handling workstations, etc., everything integrated in a way that researchers can really run their experiments at a click of a button.
Just focusing on the robots, are these collaborative robots, or are they fully encased in their own mesh field where the scientists and researchers are unable to interact with them? Is it kind of a closed system, or is it one that researchers can kind of walk throughout just for personal interest?
I mean, there are different approaches that have been used within lab automation. In our case, all of our robots are basically contained within a closed environment. So the robots will only interact with other machines, and they're not supposed to interact with the scientists. So the scientists are very much focused on planning the experiments, on supervising data quality and the like, but the whole experimental execution is something which happens by the robots in a mode where they don't have to interact with the scientists.
Yeah, I think that makes sense to me as well, because with those robots that are kind of enclosed in those spaces, I think the accuracy as well as the speed of the robots can actually be drastically increased compared to the kind of collaborative ones where they would be able to sense whether a human is working besides them. So to me, it really sounds like you have this platform where researchers are able to change the environmental settings. How scalable is this? Do you see that your lab that's fully automated would be able to be replicated to other places in the future?
So I think scalability is something which is a very interesting aspect, because as of now, if you want to conduct 2 times or 10 times the number of experiments, you need 2 times or 10 times the number of scientists. And that is something which is very different with an automated lab. So the facility that we built and the platform that we operate allows us to scale the number of experiments we run in a highly efficient way. We can, for example, switch from 12-hour to 24-hour operation. At the same time, there's also aspects such as miniaturization, which means instead of working with very large volumes of liquids that for a human scientist are easier to interact with, we can instead move into very small liquid amounts, down to picoliter volumes, which for a machine are perfectly fine to handle, and therefore basically allow us to run more experiments in parallel.
Maybe I could ask you a little bit about how the experiments themselves are configurable, because if you're saying that there's even some miniaturization of the experiments themselves being done, I would assume that for the researchers that are kind of inputting the parameters of the study that they want to be done, it's simply interacting with their computer more than it is at the lab itself. So you could just simply change a couple parameters, say on your platform, and with that, the lab would then be set up in such a way that the precise parameters would be what the researcher is actually looking for.
Yeah, so when we work with scientists, in many cases, they would basically log in online. They can then create an experiment, design the experiment, and as you said, change the parameters of interest. And afterwards, we then conduct the experiment according to these specifications. So overall, you could imagine basically the platform to work very similar to, for example, a car configurator, where you can basically click through your various settings, and in the end, you then present it with kind of the final product.
Is the final data, can it be shared with other potential clients? Of course, if they were to pay and maybe sign an NDA, I would just assume that kind of the scientific process goes a lot faster if you have this open exchange of data within science or specifically the medical industry.
I mean, open science is definitely kind of a huge trend and something which I believe is a very important trend that we can currently observe, finding more and more followers. However, at the same time, drug discovery is something where IP, where intellectual property and the rights attached to it are immensely important. And so in other words, for most biotech companies, most pharma companies, data security and data privacy are absolutely key. And we as a platform, we make sure that all of the data is stored in a safe, secure, and fully private way, so that only kind of the companies and the universities that have ordered the experiment can review their own data. So that is something which for us is obviously kind of important because we work in an industry where data and data ownership is kind of the key. But at the same time, I think open science, which in an academic setting, I think has a lot of merit.
Right. Maybe we can shift gears here a little bit and talk about the impact of jobs. So you were talking a little bit before how kind of all the manual tasks, or maybe not all, but a significant amount of the manual tasks of the actual research is being fully automated. Have you been in contact with some of your clients and discussed a little bit about the changes to their workload? Are they really able to focus more on the kind of higher level, discussions or hypothesizing, as you mentioned? Or are they just creating more research studies in order to fill this void?
I think I would like to echo what you said in the very beginning of the podcast, that what we're doing, what we're basically supporting people in, is not replacing scientists, but it is about augmenting them. So when we work with scientists, be it in academic centers or in biotech companies or in pharma companies, what we basically enable is that scientists can suddenly perform a much larger basically number of experiments using a far wider scope of different techniques. So instead of one scientist being confined to, for example, 2 or 3 techniques that they learned during their career, they can suddenly access a very broad portfolio of different techniques, methods, essays and experiments that help them answer their question in the best possible way. And that is something which makes these scientists far more powerful. So in other words, we're moving from an environment where they would do a handful of experiments slowly by hand to an environment where they can really spend their time choosing and selecting the best possible technique for their research question, and then basically give us kind of the instructions to execute these experiments. So with that in mind, I would say kind of it is about doing more work, but at the same time is also a very strong shift and a very noticeable shift in what scientists actually spend their time doing.
And I would assume that this is mostly focused for head scientists leading, entire drug discovery projects. How is this going to impact the PhDs or the masters or maybe even undergrads? I would assume that a lot of these kind of repetitive tasks in the lab would have previously been done by a number of these students. Do you see some kind of shift in the work that they are going to have to be doing if your platform, if your business grows and gets scaled out as well?
As you just said, normally kind of experimentation is something which happens manually, where it will be PhD students, postdocs, staff scientists, etc., running a lot of experiments. However, all of these scientists also have more to do than just run a manual experiment. They also have to do kind of their own basically thinking, planning, designing, etc. Just that this is at the moment only an afterthought. They will only spend maybe an hour every day with reading, hypothesizing, and thinking about their research. And that is something which we basically try to change. And so I would say the solution that we provide is something which is not only of relevance to the heads of laboratories and heads of departments, but instead for every single scientist who has to do work by hand and can now be liberated to spend their time with more genuinely scientific work.
It seems to be like there might be a potential explosion of ideas or different ways of doing drug discovery in the future if your company and the automated laboratory work really gets scaled out or grown out across many different countries. I know that your business is kind of one of the first to do this. Is there a lot of competition for these kind of automated drug discovery labs?
I mean, there are only kind of a handful of companies that really work in this space. The first two that were started were a few years ago, Emerald Cloud Lab and Transcriptic, two companies both based in California. And they really basically started out with the idea of using automation to really build a cloud laboratory where researchers around the world can use these laboratories as a platform to run their own research. And I think it will be kind of now basically the number 3 in total that is basically working on this idea of bringing automation and the benefits of automation to more and more scientists around the world. And of course, over time, all 3 companies have really evolved in a specific way and have found a specific niche they're working in. The chemistry space, in more in the molecular biology space. And in our case, it is very strongly focused on this discovery work within drug discovery, supporting biotech companies, supporting pharma companies in doing their work.
Okay, so it's not a novelty, it's really a trend that's starting. The reason I ask is I kind of want to have a better understanding or a clear future vision of laboratory work, whether it will be moving more and more to be having this fully automated, labor-free, liberated setting where scientists and researchers will be able to really focus on kind of those higher level cognitive tasks, or whether maybe the industry is so entrenched in the traditional ways of working that we will still see a lot of this manual kind of repetitive labor continuing for the next several decades.
I think what we can already see is that in all other industries where change has happened much earlier, so for example, manufacturing, where automation, electronics, machine-to-machine communication have already been playing a role for quite some time. What we can learn from these industries is that this change will happen. It's of course a question of whether it will happen within the next 2 years or the next 10 years, but it is, in my opinion, absolutely clear that change towards greater degrees of automation and greater degrees of liberation for human minds is something which is a natural consequence of having gone through this development. So in other words, I expect that the trend towards automation is going to continue, is going to get stronger and stronger, and is something which in a few years' time is hopefully going to be the new normal.
And maybe one of the final questions that's highly related to this is we're now living in an era of COVID. How has this changed or accelerated your work and this adoption of more of these automated technologies?
So what we've observed in our company is that throughout kind of the COVID pandemic, more and more people have started to realize what the benefits of remote work are and what the benefits of automation are. And so, for example, remote work is something which in laboratories so far has been completely impossible. You can't run your experiments from home. You have to be in the lab. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, scientists can get sick, and scientists need to socially distance, and they need to go into lockdown. All of the things that don't apply to robotics. We've remained open every single day throughout the pandemic, and we helped scientists in academic centers and in industry to continue their work and to remain basically productive, which I think right now all of us know how important biomedical research is and how important, for example, drug discovery and vaccine research are. And so for us, it was a great privilege to be able to help companies remain productive throughout these very challenging times.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your work with COVID. I saw on your website that there's some work being done on that. I don't know if you have some NDAs or anything surrounding that. Can you talk about how your company has been working on that?
So actually, we're not involved in COVID-19 vaccine research, but we've been involved in COVID-19 drug discovery, because there's always the two angles, basically vaccine research to ideally prevent people from getting infected in the first place, and then with the drug discovery, trying to find new agents that we can use to treat patients who've already been infected with SARS-CoV-2. And so our focus has mostly been in the drug discovery space. And that is something where we had basically a few collaborations, and I can also mention some of them. So for example, we've been collaborating with the Hong Kong-based drug discovery company In Silico Medicine, which is basically one of the leaders in AI-driven drug discovery. So they've basically designed a new set of inhibitors against a target known as JAKs, Janus kinases, where they very rapidly worked on designing inhibitors against this class of targets. And we've then been testing these new inhibitors and profiling and characterizing them as a potential way to treat patients who've already been infected with SARS-CoV-2.
And do you see, maybe this goes a little bit outside of the scope of the podcast, but do you see these kind of drugs taking still another 10, 15 years-ish before they're out on the market? Or is there now kind of an overall push to have these pushed out a little bit quicker?
So we know that throughout the pandemic, the FDA, for example, has already said very clearly that some of the changes they're doing right now to expedite the review of new drugs is something they want to keep doing and continue doing even after the pandemic, because they've realized that what we desperately need is these new treatments and new therapies. So if they can basically do their part in accelerating the process, I think they're now very open to try and do that.
Okay, I'm really happy that we are able to dive into a little bit about the kind of automated future vision that your company is potentially bringing about, as well as how this automated drug discovery lab is augmenting scientists rather than completely replacing them. I think that's one of the things that's always on people's minds whenever they hear about a new sector being automated. How can people get a hold of you, follow your work? I'll of course put your website up in the show notes, but if there's maybe somebody that wants to contact you directly, what's the best way that they can do that?
So I think there's basically two kind of very good ways of basically learning a bit more about what we're doing and on getting in touch. So one is that we do have a company blog on Medium, and this is something where we basically try to share basically new ideas, new concepts, as well as a bit of our take on things happening in the industry. So the company blog is basically one thing I'd basically highly recommend. And the second thing is that we basically use LinkedIn quite extensively. So people are very welcome to contact me on LinkedIn, get in touch, and also kind of to follow the news that we basically regularly post on LinkedIn as well.
Terrific. Well, I'll have both of those up on the show notes. Martin, thank you very much for coming on to the podcast and sharing, explaining a little bit about how drug discovery is done, and of course your interesting work with Arctoris. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Mark. It was a pleasure to be here.
So thanks for listening to this week's episode. If you want to support the podcast, you can leave a like or a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you want to get in touch, feel free to do so over Twitter or LinkedIn by searching for Automated Podcast. On the website, automatedpodcast.org, you can leave a comment on any of the episodes, read the transcripts, and look at the sources I use in all of these episodes. There are also blog articles and additional resources and information on this topic and podcast if you are looking for more. See you next week.
The Automated Podcast.